Beloveds, welcome. Welcome to another special offering of Nurture the Soul. It is such an honor and a blessing to be here with you today. I am your host. I am Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I'm the Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team. And we are a part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. I use they, them pronouns, and I have short pixie cut blonde hair that is pulled back today. I have a black tank top on and round wooden earrings that are hanging from my ear. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with multitudes of practical, educational, and innovative formational resources in which to engage the critical topics of our time and to center the care and the education for the people of God. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural churches, and the ministry with youth and children to a wide array of justice issues. We invite guest artists, authors, theologians, biblical scholars, pastors, key leaders. It is endless who can be a part of the Nurture the Soul webinar series. Nurture the Soul stays current to how the gospel is alive in this time. And we hope that this virtual space is a space for connection, for community and nurture, because we believe in the collective movement towards the world that God imagines for all of us. So you can join us at 3:30 p.m. every Thursday for our regular Nurture the Soul series. And from time to time, you'll have special offerings like the one here today. You can find out more about Nurture the Soul by visiting www.ucc.org/events or on any and all of our social media platforms. And beloveds, if these conversations move you, if what is offered here today helps to enhance your ministry, to help you reach out into the community, to do advocacy, or it even nurtures your soul, we hope that you consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting the letters UCC to the numbers 41444. It is your prayerful and financial support that helps programs like this continue the essential work of the United Church of Christ. And of course, we thank you for supporting us, but really we thank you for being with us today. And we hope that you have an opportunity, if you're watching us live, to tell somebody else about the program. If you're watching it later, when you get your follow-up email, please share so that way we can get the message out to all folks. But before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to remind you that there is a chat feature to share when you're Zooming in. And we'd love for you to let us know where you're Zooming in from and keep that conversation going, however you imagine and envision that for the chat. You can find the chat button at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a dialogue bubble out of one of those old cartoons, and it has 3 dots in the middle of it. We also invite you to use the Q&A feature, specifically if you want to ask a question to our panelists today or at any time. And we will cover those questions at the end. Again, you can find that dialogue bubble at the bottom with the question mark for Q&A and type in your question. We will do our best to answer it live. Well, today, I just want to invite my folks onto screen here and just say I am in awe of the panel that we have today for this really important conversation. We have a Reverend Dr. Piwa Flongani, who currently works for the UCC Center for Analytics, Research and Development, and Data. Like, I am nerding out. That is my huge favorite pastime, is to go deep into data with people who know it. That's a little thing you may not know about me. Reverend Doctor is quite skilled at detecting and decreasing various societal gaps, especially with those who are multiple minoritized identity. They have worked with those identities to help them align with the mainstream by helping people reframe society's tendencies to lean into fear as a default. So always trying to break down those barriers. We have another Reverend Doctor here, Reverend Dr. Beverly Dale, also known as Rev Bev, who is a disciple of Christ pastor whose ministry has been at the intersections of sexuality and spirituality. She founded and developed the curriculum for the Incarnation Institute for Sex and Faith that seeks to equip pastors and sexual health professionals to help people heal from problematic Christian teaching by using inclusive, science-friendly, and sex-positive Christianity. We're going to be seeing a lot from Rev Bev in 2025 as we are highlighting her book, Who Told You That You Were Naked? Meditations on the Sexual Body. I have goosebumps. I cannot wait for that. And my last esteemed guest to be with us today, the person who helped to make this conversation happen, is Reverend Amy Johnson, who serves as the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice in the National Ministry setting of the United Church of Christ. Amy is our whole lives trainer for all levels and has trained groups nationwide and internationally. She's passionate about supporting people in organizations and communities to create healthier, braver spaces in which people can thrive as their authentic selves. And so, beloveds, I am so very lucky to stay on camera with you today to help moderate this conversation. And I'd like to invite our panelists to help us better understand how we as faith leaders or even faith practitioners can go about demystifying bodily autonomy and even maybe understanding a little bit of the nuances behind what bodily autonomy is. And so I will turn it over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Ellie. I am Reverend Amy Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve on the Gender and Sexuality Justice Ministries team. So this idea of bodily autonomy is something that we talk about a whole lot. And I want to say that for me, and also in our work in the national setting of the United Church of Christ, bodily autonomy is about recognizing my own knowing, each of our own knowing, deep knowing of who we are as beloved children of God, created and called very good. And specifically what that means is that my pronouns are not up to anyone else to decide. And it means that medical care for my body, for my pregnancy, for instance, should be decided by me and my medical provider, not legislated by people who are not those people. It means that I believe as a matter of justice that all people should have available to them education about how bodies work and what healthy relationships are, and to be able to have those discussions with medically accurate, age-appropriate, inclusive material so that no one is left out of that conversation because no one is left out of God's kingdom. So that is a little bit about what bodily autonomy means to me. And I think that it's also important to say that all of these conversations need to happen without shame and stigma, because shame and stigma can be fatal. So bodily autonomy is sacred. It's very sacred, a term that I use, and I don't use it lightly. And those are all the things that we're talking about in our ministries when we're talking about that.
I'm note-taking, y'all. I'm already note-taking. We're 2 minutes into the webinar, so thank you. Hiwa, would you like to share a little bit about what bodily autonomy is for you?
Hey, greetings, everyone. I bodily autonomy, I mean, it means a lot and not much for other people in other places. So at least when I work with innovation and working kind of in our congregational settings with folk, I'm constantly kind of looking at bodily autonomy as it relates to consent in the widest sense of the word, so people being able to have choices about what happens to their bodies, how they use their bodies, how they engage with others, and a lot of our different missions and ministries in the UCC and our other partner organizations really do kind of focus and hinge around this idea of consent. Like consent is essential, it's necessary. I believe it to be an important part of our faith as well. And so I invite congregations and churches and leaders and ministries to innovatively explore the ways in which they're actually communicating consent and bodily autonomy in their practices. One simple way, for example, is, when we're in a congregational setting and we are in that greeting line at the end of worship or passing the peace, how do we practice consent in those times of being able to greet one another or to share with each other, So being able to weave into the practices of the community how we might be able to articulate and practice consent with each other, and how key it is, with how we move from that space, for people of all ages. One thing, even as a pastor, back when I was serving as a local church pastor, in the greeting line with our young folk, trying to bring my eyes down to their level, I might crouch and invite them to say, hey, would you like to shake my hand, do a high five, fist bump, or none of the above? And some of them will be shy and, wanting to, not pressure them into greeting the pastor, be mindful also of that power differential, but really being able to invite them into practicing consent, even at a young age, in a way that this faith community becomes another place, and maybe for some, the only place where they have the bodily autonomy in practice. And we get to kind of weave innovatively these practices of appreciating, honoring, and practicing bodily autonomy, even with stuff as little as greeting one another on a weekly basis.
Yeah, very practical. Thank you for that. Rev Bev.
Yeah, bodily autonomy, I think, means being empowered to be authentically who we are, who we see ourselves to be. And you alluded that to a little bit, Ellie, at the beginning, that who do we think God has created us to be? Or who do we feel like we're moving and growing into? And in order to do that, we have to have the freedom to do it in our own heads, but also freedom from other people's rules about who we are supposed to be, should be. If you're going to be a Christian, you have to be this way. You're going to be male, you have to be this way. And recognizing that our body autonomy sounds so good and living authentically sounds so good. And yet we live in a large bubble here that has a lot of vested interest and corporate interest and political interest in keeping us from living authentically. So that's really the issue that I hone in on. And then the other piece to that is, if we want to live autonomously as to who we feel like we're being called to be, it means I have to accept where other people are too. And recognize that none of us are perfect, and we're simply called to be faithful and not perfect. And of course, I want to say not perfectly sexual beings, because sexuality has a lot of stuff in it that creates shame and anxiety and guilt. We've got to learn to let that go, because that hampers our ability to live authentic lives. So body autonomy for me is to say, this is who I am without apology. And we have to always learn to say that in a context in which there's a lot of social forces and family members and whatever trying to push us to conform to be who they think we should be, or who they think the Bible says we should be, et cetera, et cetera. So to live authentically is to say, this is who God made me to be. At least this is how I think now, and who God is making me to be in the future. Who knows? So to have bodily autonomy, we want to live in a community that supports everybody's autonomy. And that's where we get to, how do we create body justice, and how do we create sexual justice for everyone? So we all have the freedom to develop and grow and be who we think God is calling us to be. So I think that's kind of where I would put it.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. I think a lot about how our biblical text talks about bodies. And then what we hear, or what we understand when we read those kinds of things, what it is about our bodies from a biblical standpoint. And I think because so many, what I have witnessed in my short 50 years of life here, is that we struggle We struggle with talking about the body as it relates to our biblical text, and we struggle to talk about bodies in real time. And so I'm really curious if each of you can dive in a bit deeper to how bodily autonomy is showing up like in real time, whether it be through a biblical lens or through our, socio-political lens right now. How is bodily autonomy showing up for us this year? And then what is that impact for us on the ballot?
Yeah, this is Amy. And, there are some really specific ways that this is showing up on the ballots this year. And I think that what's really important, Rev Bev, as you were talking about, like if I want the right to have my own bodily autonomy, I have to understand that everyone else does too, right? I know Brene Brown talks about how everybody's doing the best they can. And if we really believe that, how does that inform how we move forward? So, so I think that there's a few things, and particularly I think that for this webinar, right, a United Church of Christ webinar, thinking about what does the United Church of Christ say about some of these issues. And that's always a challenge in the United Church of Christ, right? Because we're so congregationally rooted that it's hard sometimes to find one decision about any of these issues. But we do kind of go back to like General Synod, and what is a synod, which is a setting where the whole church comes together and decides, what do we think is important? What do we think that we need to stand for? So I want to talk about a few of those things in terms of history in the United Church of Christ as a mainstream Christian denomination, and how we have decided some things together over the last 50 years in terms of these issues. So one of them is about reproductive justice. And reproductive justice is more than reproductive health, which is important. It's important to have the ability to be healthy and to have access to get our health needs met. It's important to have rights to be able to do that. But reproductive justice is a term that was coined by a group called Sister Song. And reproductive justice has 4 tenets. And one of them is the right to personal bodily autonomy. And another one is the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent children we do have in safe and sustainable communities. So since 1971, so that's even more than 50 years, y'all, the United Church of Christ has multiple resolutions supporting bodily autonomy in a number of ways, particularly in terms of choice of pregnancy and the right of a person to follow their own personal, religious, and moral convictions about completing or terminating that pregnancy. So we have multiple resolutions supporting that. And that we call on our church in all settings to provide education and resources and programs to reduce unintended pregnancies. So that is one area where this is showing up all over the place on the ballots, particularly since 2022, when the Dobbs decision came down and Roe v. Wade was overturned. There have been multiple, lots and lots of ways that this issue has shown up on the ballot, and it's here this year as well. And I think what's really important for us is we're talking about bodily autonomy and talking about our own personal convictions, is to really look inside and say, okay, that's what the UCC says. What do I believe? And when I am voting for a person or an initiative or anything on the ballot, what do they believe about this? And does that align with what I believe? I think that's important for us to be informed. Education is a big part of the United Church of Christ. And so being informed of who we are voting for and what they stand for is really important. And it's important for us to do that due diligence and know that when we are casting our ballots, particularly around reproductive justice as it relates to bodily autonomy. Another area where there are just a sadly huge number of legislative bills in this legislative session that has already passed. There were over 600 bills that were somehow removing rights for LGBTQ and mostly trans and non-binary folks. In the United Church of Christ, we also have a long history of standing up for and advocating for people, regardless of their orientation or gender identity. Since 1979, we have passed lots of resolutions about the dignity, the human dignity, the care, the ability for people to get married, the ability for people to be recognized in church leadership. So not to just like pay lip service to this idea, but to actually put it into action, to really embrace the full humanity and human dignity of all people, of God's diversity, of God's beloved creation. And there have been over 600 bills, like I said, this year alone across the United States legislatively to take away rights to medical care, rights to, there are some that would allow parents or mandate parents be prosecuted for abuse if they look for and try to receive that medical care for their children. These are legislation attempts to erase the identity of our beloved siblings, of our beloved children of God. And we also know that when these laws do pass, that suicides go up to 72%. That's a recent study that came out. So it's important. It's important to be aware of what is on the ballot and of, again, if you're voting for a person, what their stance is on these issues, because bodily autonomy is involved with all of this, and being able to decide our medical care, the medical care of our children, of our parents, of our friends, all of that is on the line. It's on the line right now, and it's really important. I want to say one word about my personal portfolio. Those are things, those two issues, big issues, right? Giant issues that the Gender and Sexuality Justice Ministries team takes on. And my portfolio is more around sexuality education. And so I encourage you to vote for sexuality education, because it is important for us to be able to give our children information about their bodies and how they work, about normalizing different identities and orientations, whether they live in a family, have a relative, know somebody, have a friend, it's them themselves. It doesn't matter. We're all in this world together, and we need to be able to understand each other so that we can live and work together for God's kingdom to be here on earth. So it's important to know that there is a plethora of something called parents' rights bills, where parents are trying to have more say in what is and isn't taught in education. And while that sounds good on the surface, it's also concerning, because a lot of times what those laws are doing is pulling back education, wanting to ban books, wanting to reduce access to information. So it's really important, if one of those kind of laws, or if your legislature is voting on that, that you understand what that means. One of the specific things that has been passed in several states like Tennessee and North Dakota is something called a Baby Olivia bill. And this is a bill that requires children to view a video. It's called the Baby Olivia video. And this video is misleading. It's medically inaccurate. It has a false timeline for pregnancy and fetal development. It misrepresents fetal characteristics. It goes against the medical guidelines. It goes against the medical guidelines of the American College for Gynecologists and Obstetricians. And people are putting this bill into law and requiring children to view it as a way of saying this is sex ed. It is not sexuality education. It is misinformation. And it's important for us to be able to be aware of that, and to know that the national sex ed standards do not recommend viewing an ultrasound video or pseudo ultrasound video for sexuality education. It's much more than that. It's about our values and our bodies and our relationships and communication and all of those kinds of things. So I'll stop there. But those are several things that are on the ballot, and that, in my view, go against the belovedness of our creation that has been called good, That's biblical. It's in Genesis. And that that we need to be aware of and be really savvy when we are looking at what we're voting for this year.
I love that. And I just realized that my face gave all of the expressions during your presentation. So I hope you give me grace and space to be fully in my body and embodying the things that we hear. Very important work. Thank you very much, Amy, for that. Kiwa, what about you? Where are we seeing, can you dive deeper into this?
I mean, first of all, Amy, I'm always in awe of what you bring, the gifts that you bring to this work. There's a lot that I needed growing up in this country that you just said in the summary that really literally would have changed the whole trajectory of my life for the better. And so my hope is that folk would be willing and open to just a vast amount of resources and educational things that we can do to like really prepare ourselves to be faithful when we get to those polls, right? To be able to honor, this idea that Paul gives us like as the body of Christ. If we are the body, how are we caring for this body as we go cast our votes? How are we caring for this body as we, act in, political and religious and all these other different ways in our sociological interactions with one another? Many of you maybe have heard me speak on, this idea that political is personal, but personal must not be political. And what I mean by that is, this idea that the political, what happens in legislation impacts us personally, some of us more than others, with laws that kind of like maybe restrict our bodily autonomy or who we're able to love or how we're able to parent our children and take care of them medically and so on and so forth. But this idea that many of these laws are written out of fear around particular identities or genders, and this idea that we can take people's personhood and flip it into these political performances that really are never even about the thing that they claim to be about, and so that's the danger of making the personal political, even though the political is personal. We must bring that into our faith. We must bring that into our poll. We must bring that into our actions if we are the people of Christ that we say that we are, and I love Paul's imagery often around the body, right? How we don't saw off our limbs, we don't, inject poison into our bodies purposefully, our physical bodies. And yet we do that in practice in our churches, in our politics, in our communities, in our rhetoric, how we speak about people who give birth, not necessarily women. There are people who are able to carry and produce life, and there's some who choose it and some who don't. And there are many ways in which we can be, and we are, and as Rev Bev was speaking to, like becoming who we are authentically, individually, but also as the body of Christ. We must be mindful of the ways in which our languaging, our legislation wraps the fear and the lack of consent and stripping away bodily autonomy in the ways in which we put together this legislation, and being able to be mindful of how we might be able to faithfully respond to these fear tactics that would have us actually do violence to God's creation. The political is personal, but the personal must not be political.
Wow, you just preached. I said that was going to happen today, right? Yeah, Rep Bev, what you got?
Wow. Oh, thank you, Piwan. And also Amy. I'm going to, before I studied theology, I studied sociology, which is the big picture. So I'm going to pull on some of that right now. But I just want to say that we are living in a time right now of sexual moral panic. And I get that language from theologian Marvin Ellison. sexual moral panic because, and then I'm going to pull on, there's a book called Christianity After Religion by Diana Bass. And she posits that Christianity is changing in the middle of all of this mess that we're in, and it will emerge different. So we're in the middle of that change. And she does not talk about the sexual moral panic, but that's really where we are. And because the system is in the throes of trying to push to keep those systems in place, systems of power and domination. And empire, which is what this is trying to hold back egalitarianism, hold back the democratic impulses that's happening. And this is happening all over the world, but it's certainly happening in the US now. And the focus is around the body, the sexual body. So the empire, or what Paul would call powers and principalities, okay? The empire is about creating an order of value on bodies. So the system feeds on racial dynamics and sexism and classism and heteronormativity, all that stuff, because some bodies are more important than other bodies and therefore of more value. So I'm going to suggest that now we have an entire right-wing political party or certain pieces of the political party that's jumping out of its skin right now to restrict the body. So when we are sexually wounded and we live in shame, we want to take revenge on those bodies who might have it more together than we do. And we project onto them all the horrible things that we can think of. So we have all of these anti-woman, controlling the women, the reproductive freedom, and the anti-trans, controlling those. Then Amy has mentioned the book bans, controlling knowledge about Black and brown bodies and about gay bodies. Even in sex education, we got to control what children learn at an early age. And what that does when the empire is trying to control sexual bodies to keep this order of some bodies have more value than other bodies, then we begin to live in a culture of shame, right? Because even the youngest child knows that they'll play with anybody and they don't care what they look like. And so there is a child-centered piece of ourselves that recognize that the lessons we have learned about our bodies, sometimes from the church, have been dysfunctional for our intimate relationships. They've been harmful for who we see ourselves to be. And sometimes they've just been flat out wrong if we're in a search for being authentic. So I just have to, since Amy mentioned sex education, I do have to say that I just learned that in Florida, thanks to the governor, that there is a ban on sex education classes from mentioning, are you ready for this? Anatomy and contraceptives. And all districts are now required to promote abstinence, exclude consent. That means they're not teaching any kid about how to say, no, this is as far as you go, and remove all pictures of reproductive organs. So that is sexual moral panic. Let me give you an example of somebody who is actually a Republican state representative in Idaho. Dan Foreman is his name. It was a senator, not a representative. And he's a retired cop, and he's known for a very short anger fuse and his Christian nationalist theology. And I think he represents this sexual moral panic. He sent out one Facebook, and in this Facebook post, he says, abortion is murder. Gender affirming care for trans people is sick and demonically influenced. Homosexuality is an abomination. And this is pure racism and antipathy towards the other, because what prompted this, and everybody who knew him knows what it was that he made headlines for telling a Native American woman to go back where she came from. So this is one white Christian nationalist male who's feeling out of control and in a panic, and he is not alone. So that's where we sit now in the powers and principalities of that are aimed at keeping us conforming to our position of little value, more value, not so much value, in the whole scheme of the empire. And we have corporations who have a vested interest in keeping that running. So I won't go any more into that, but just to say we have to be able to recognize that in the midst of the panic that is pushing down on sexual freedom, bodily autonomy, we have to push back, because there are people who are going to be harmed, are being harmed, children who are already going to be damaged because of what we are withholding and what we are teaching. This is about our future. It's not about the wealthy people at the top. It's got to be not about the powerful people. It is not just for Christians or any particular brand of Christians who want to control government and make everybody in their own image. It's really about body justice in the whole grand scheme of things. It's really about sexual justice. And the statistics show how dangerous this is. I think I'll stop there.
Well, I think that what everybody shared was really, really valuable. And I really wish Reverend Nicholson was with us today, who unfortunately has fallen ill and not able to be present, because I would definitely like to hear what they had to share for us today. And so hopefully we'll have them back again. You know, I think the third question I'm asking is similar, but it's an invitation to go a little bit deeper. So much of what each of you have shared and what I've heard repeatedly is dignity of all of God's creation, sacredness of the body. You know, really understanding, how do we communicate? So it seems like there is, the less we communicate, the better off the world will be. But that has never worked. So I don't understand why we keep, I mean, I know why, right? But I don't understand why we keep going back to that. And so I think for this final question from me, and I invite the folks in the participants to share a Q&A with us. We'll cover those at the end. But you know, because this is a special offering for this political season, because we've seen this before, right? This is not new. What does it mean for us to engage in this time with our bodies? And are there some things that you can invite us to think about differently? We have so many commercials, radio ads, political signs that are all over. We're just inundated in it. And I noticed they all say the same thing, right? It's the repetition. They've even clipped certain political commercials have been the same line from the same political candidate 3 times in a row, right? There's that masterful repetition and the use of repetition. But what aren't we hearing? What should we consider when we go to cast our ballot? And some of us are in the process of casting our ballots now, right? With early voting. So yeah. We'll start with you, Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. And I think, you know, there's just so much to think about, and it can be overwhelming. But I think when we're talking about like bringing our bodies into this work, and it is a work right now, it is work about this election season to be really informed and to be aware and to stay in our bodies, right? To stay in our bodies when we're making decisions. Our Faith, Our Vote campaign slogan this year is vote with love. So what does that mean? That means that if we're talking about what Rev Bev is talking about, the sexual and moral panic, that's rooted in fear. So what do I need to do with my body to calm it down, to calm my brain down so that I can really literally vote with love, that I can vote with the love not only for myself, but to think about who else is involved. I'm hearing a beloved colleague, Reverend Dr. Velda Love. I have her voice in my head all the time, do your work, do your work. And so I'm speaking particularly to my white beloved out here on this call. We need to think about who is being centered in whatever legislation or whatever candidate or whatever bill or whatever initiative that we're voting for, and to think about how much better the world would be for everyone if we centered those that are the most affected, those that aren't thought of by the empire and the principalities. We can be so focused and so unaware because we're taught that way. It's on purpose that we are taught to uphold the things that are already here and not change them. So it can feel very disruptive to move against that. And that's important to do, because when we center, for instance, accessibility, when we think about things like, the impact of anything about reproductive justice has a whole different level of impact on Black and Brown and Indigenous and bodies of the global majority. That is a completely compounded impact. And that the same is true with LGBTQ issues. So we need to think about love for all, love for the entirety of our communities. And again, I'm going to be the sacredness and beloved diversity of creation when we're thinking about what are we going to vote about for this particular situation or this particular person. And I also just want to, again, make my plug for voting for sex education, whether that's your local school board. That's probably the most important vote for you, is who's going to be on your local school board in terms of that, in terms of sex education that's medically accurate and comprehensive and age appropriate and inclusive. And then also just thinking about when we're talking about protecting life, thinking about how that shows up in so many different ways. And Piwa was talking about it's not always women who are the people who are giving birth. So thinking about, like, if there's a gestational father who requires a particular kind of care to complete a pregnancy, is what I'm voting for going to allow that infusion of life into our world? Can we expand enough to include everyone and to be joyful about that? And then I just also want to say one other thing, which seems like maybe a non sequitur, but I also, there are opportunities for many of us to take our bodies to the polls in the capacity of a poll chaplain or a poll peacekeeper. And that is particularly important right now, that we are able, those of us who feel like we can and are able to do that, to step up in that way, so that our voting places can be more accessible, more safe. I'm not going to go as far as to say safe and accessible. That's a stretch in a lot of places, but to provide more of that. So if you are a person who has privilege and ability to do that, I highly encourage you to do so. And I am going to stop there for my esteemed colleagues.
Thank you very much, Amy. I really appreciate that. And, a lot of our state ecumenical, like the National Council for Churches, so a lot of your council of churches, a lot of your ecumenical councils have information and training on how to go be a poll chaplain, how to be a poll monitor. So if you are in a state, type in your state name and type in Council of Church or Ecumenical Council, and it'll pop up. And I bet you 90% of them are working towards poll training for poll monitoring and poll chaplaincy for sure. So yeah, thank you for that, Amy. And I hear a lot, I put in the chat for everyone. You said you heard Reverend Velda Love in your head. I put in the resource for Join the Movement on election season spiritual care packages. And this, while some of it dates back to a previous election, it's still relevant, right? We're still hearing and needing the same things. And so thank you. Piwa, how about you?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I have two kind of main things I wanted to highlight. And Amy, you already started talking about the first one is languaging, right? And so in the UCC, we have been very mindful and intentional about being inclusive for decades, right? As we're kind of moving into this new season and life is not what it once was before, being mindful, not just to be inclusive, but to move toward being expansive. And I find like it's a slight difference, but the difference being, around inclusivity that often requires assimilating or that requires an erasure of some of our identities to make space for, or to kind of fit into whatever the norm may be. And so, being mindful, like really trying to strive, I guess, toward being more expansive, which actually is a lot more in tune with the abundant God that we serve, where we know there's a room for all of us, for each of us, even not just all, but each, really kind of shifts how we engage that. And so I want to bring up that specifically around, when we talk about being able, to how we speak about, offering care to folk, maybe non-traditional, access to healthcare and parenting and resources around all of those. We don't get stuck then trying to argue around languaging that if we can say, birthing parent and women, we can make room for in an expansive way for people who still identify as women, but not feeling like we have to erase them to make room for folk who do not identify as women. So just finding ways of being expansive, so that we don't support empire and start battling amongst each other. Well, if we have room for you, that means you're taking away from me. And like, so really just trying to make sure we can expand things and not just include, because including continues to kind of build upon this hierarchical system of putting some bodies as more valuable than others. And then the second thing I wanted to bring up, and it looks like someone in the chat has kind of, mentioned this idea that, this isn't a new thing, right, around this presidential election, although it's at a critical pitch right now. I think way, 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 way back to our spiritual ancestors, when Jesus was asked, about that coin, about what we needed to give to Caesar, right? That quip of Jesus to say, giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and the giving to God what is God's. That has a lot to me to do with this bodily autonomy and like kind of splicing how it is that we're engaging with our political, societal, faith engagements with one another. And it was so cryptic, but it's also really beautiful. And I think a challenge for all of us, whatever it is that we're doing, voting, writing laws, challenging them, educating, teaching, preaching, healing, whatever we're doing, if we're more mindful of this image of the empire on the empire's goods, but then more importantly, noticing that we all are an image of God. How does that shape what I'm doing, how I'm moving in the world, right? How I'm voting, how I'm interacting with one another. It has to change how it is that I engage. If I take very seriously that each of us are made in God's image, and to be mindful of the ways in which what we do and how we do it, not actually doing violence to God's creation. And so how we bring that into our practices, in our actions, in our different spheres of influence, being able to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but we make sure that we're giving to God what is God's, and making sure that our human systems that we're constructing are not actually doing violence to God's creation.
Amen. Rev Bev, I'm glad you get to follow up.
Oh my goodness, Piwa, thank you for bringing up that scripture. I had not thought about that in relation to this conversation, but give to God what is God's. And our bodies, all the bodies of God's children are not Caesar's. And that is the dilemma that you have brought before us, is the dilemma where there is a Caesar, if you will, attempting to control pleasure, control our ability to think and reason and critique, control freedom in so many ways. So that's really what we're up against. So that's the big picture, but I've got to get back to this, that the best thing we can do, besides going to the poll, of course, and thinking carefully when we cast that ballot, is all of us have to ask ourselves, what am I ashamed of in my body? How has my hesitance, my shame, created in authenticity for me, in my relationships, in people, in understanding who other people are. You know, we have all been deformed by the Caesar thinking. And so how do we recover from that is to take responsibility for our own healing, being aware that Caesar does not want us to heal because we cannot be controlled when we are being authentic. Authenticity is the very antithesis of what the powers and principalities want to have happen. So we have to examine ourselves. Where have I paid a price for being inauthentic? And then because what happens is that we then in turn treat other people in ways that are not as loving or as accepting because we're not clued in, we're not listening, we're not sensitive to the ways in which we have been seduced. And then, so taking responsibility for our own inner healing about our own bodies will help us open our eyes to the ways in which we have failed one another. And then the next important thing is we have to build communities. We have to find clusters of people in our churches or outside our churches who are striving to be authentic, sexually authentic, and bodily autonomous and live in freedom, and build communities, because when this all goes down, we have to have other people who will keep us on the path toward healing, toward wholeness, and that will take us towards sexual freedom and bodily autonomy. Thinking of other people, those who are marginalized, kicked to the curbs, you know, it all comes down on those folks first, including our children. But we're talking about the future here and what's ahead of us. So this vote makes a lot of all of us very nervous about just how important it is, because it's so obvious now about what Caesar is attempting to do, what empire religion is attempting to do as it relates to our bodies. So voting obviously is hugely important now.
Yes, yes to that. Wow. I just want to invite everyone who is watching live or who might be watching this later to just check in with our bodies. Where are you right now? How's your breathing? How's your mind? Where are you holding tension? And then what does sending love and breath to those spaces look like? Beloveds, we are gifts of God. For God, to God, for each other. Blessed be. And it is time. It's always time, but it is time to show what love looks like in our words, in our actions, and with our vote. Because I don't know about you, but I've heard from these brilliant thought leaders in so many different realms. And again, we're missing one today, that have shared words that may have made us uncomfortable. And that's okay, because look, I can still love. And maybe more importantly, as my therapist would say, it's okay to accept love as well, Ellie. Right? So this election season, if there is something you don't understand, educate yourself. Do not let Caesar prevent you from being knowledgeable. And then say, how does this impact me? And how does this impact the person I have yet to meet? And then where can you reconcile that? Because we are being called to show love in real time right now. Amen?
Mm-hmm.
So, beloveds, I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar today. There were no Q&As, and I would take this webinar a whole nother 30 minutes with all of the questions that I wrote down, but that's okay. We are going to revisit this conversation in the new year, hopefully with, definitely with Rev Bev, but hopefully with some other folks. We'll be delving a lot deeper into what our denomination, what our faith practices ask of our bodies, and what do our bodies ask of our faith practices. But for now, I want to thank you for joining us for the webinar, for the beloveds that are here with us. What a gift it is to be in this virtual space with you. And tomorrow we get to come back at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our second session of discovering wellness in your ministry setting. We're actually going to focus on some programs that could be developed over the next several months that'll take you away from this kind of conversation and take you into celebrating what it is to give thanks, what it is to recognize the land that we are on, what it is for us to recognize the birth of Christ. And so we have a wonderful, light-hearted filled day tomorrow. I hope you join us and be ready to share in the chat tomorrow about some ideas that you have on how we can use the arts to bring people together to examine the wellness in our ministries. Amy, Piwa, and Bev, thank you. Thank you so very much for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Bev, to take us out.
Okay. So I love the fact that you call us beloved. So let's do that. So, beloved, take care of your beautiful body. Love your beautiful body. And then be the gift to one another, to those bodies around you who also long to be fully who they are. Be love to one another in real time. Go into your world, and when you love and you care for bodies, you are loving and caring for the creation of God. Go in peace. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.